Not for Suella Braverman, the adage that revenge is a dish best served cold. She delivers a piping hot, blistering attack on Rishi Sunak, politically and personally, and accuses him of never having any intention of keeping his promises. Suella Braverman's incendiary attack sounds like a rallying call for the right of the party. So how politically dangerous is she for the Prime Minister? We'll be speaking to the Tory MP Martin Vickers, and ahead of tomorrow's Supreme Court ruling on the government's Rwanda policy, we'll be joined by Diana Johnson, the Labour chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee. Also tonight, in a major investigation, we have for the first time established an apparent financial link between the Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich and Vladimir Putin after years of Abramovich denials.
It's new material which justifies those UK and EU sanctions and raises the question of whether the United States should follow.
And the White House says it now has its own evidence Hamas has been using Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital as a military HQ. We ask an advisor to Israel's Prime Minister about an assault on the compound, which has become a lightning rod for the debate about a ceasefire. Good evening. Suella Braverman was never going to go quietly, but her three-page letter reads like a comprehensive, coldly furious takedown of the Prime Minister. She reminded Rishi Sunak that her support had been pivotal to his victory after he'd been rejected by a majority of party members during the summer leadership contest, and accused him of never having had any intention of keeping his promises he'd made to her, particularly on migration. She accuses him of equivocation, disregard and a lack of interest, and is scathing about his handling of the Rwanda legislation, which she believes will hold her plans for deportation below the waterline whichever way the Supreme Court ruling goes tomorrow. That crucial ruling is due at about 11 hours' time from now, and Nick is here. Nick, tell me about that letter from Suella Braverman today.
Well, Kirsty, this is nothing less than a full frontal assault on Rishi Sunak's personality and what Suella Braverman regards as his failings as Prime Minister. Now, you've got to go all the way back to 1990 and that electrifying resignation speech by Geoffrey Howe after he felt that Margaret Thatcher had made his position in Cabinet absolutely impossible. This is what the late Deputy Prime Minister had to say.
It's rather like sending your opening batsman to the crease, only for them to find, the moment the first balls are bowled, that their bats have been broken before the game by the team captain.
Now, we're not in that territory now, but Suella Braverman is on the warpath and she is providing political ammunition to the Prime Minister's critics. OK,
so there was so much in that letter that had big red pens all over it. Take us through it.
So, two big themes, a highly personal attack on Rishi Sunak's integrity and an attack on his policy failings. So, on Rishi Sunak's personality, Suella Braverman says he cannot be trusted. That is because he allegedly broke a deal that they had agreed on, which prompted her to support his bid for number 10. That deal, she said, covered reducing legal migration, stopping the European Court of Human Rights from disrupting their plans to stop the small boats, and introducing what she described as unequivocal statutory guidance to schools to protect biological sex. Suella Braverman says none of that happened. And just look at what she says. You have manifestly and repeatedly failed to deliver on every single one of these key policies. Either your distinctive style of government means you are incapable of doing so, or, as I must surely conclude now, you never had any intention of keeping your promises.
It must be one of the strongest ever attacks. It's not a resignation letter, in a letter like that. So that's on the personal side. But drill down into policy now.
Yes, so an attack on two core areas. A failure to deal, as she says, properly with small boats, and a failure to crack down on anti-Semitism and extremism. So, on small boats, Suella Braverman says the Prime Minister is guilty of a double failure. Failure to prepare for a loss in the Supreme Court tomorrow, and a failure to prepare for a win. The court, of course, will be ruling in the morning on the government's plan to send illegal migrants to Rwanda. And again, look at what she said. You opted instead for wishful thinking as a comfort blanket to avoid having to make hard choices. This irresponsibility has wasted time and left the country in an impossible position. And finally, Suella Braverman accuses the Prime Minister of failing to attack anti-Semitism and extremism. She accused him of resisting her calls to introduce new legislation to ban what she describes as hate marches that have been held since the Hamas massacre on the 7th of October. Again, this is what she wrote. As on so many other issues, you sought to put off tough decisions in order to minimise political risks to yourself. In doing so, you've increased the very real risk these marches present to everyone else. So look, a really big moment. Downing Street have completely lost patience with Suella Braverman. But interestingly tonight, Conservative MPs on the right hearing from people in the Home Office who might be not on Suella Braverman's side, saying she's got this one right.
Thanks very much, Nick. Well, tomorrow's ruling by the Supreme Court will certainly not be the end of the story, as Nick says. New Home Secretary James Cleverly has made it clear that he is committed to stopping the boats. It's also one of the Prime Minister's 5 pledges. And one of the most contentious elements of the law, alluded to by Suella Braverman, is Rule 39 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Here's Seema with all of the details around tomorrow's judgment and the potential next steps for the government.
Tonight, 5 Supreme Court judges are the only ones who are likely to know which way tomorrow's much-awaited judgment will go. The Supreme Court is the final court of appeal in the UK and is set to deliver a decision on whether the government can send asylum seekers to Rwanda. This ruling comes after judges at the Court of Appeal in June ruled that the plan was unlawful and could breach Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which prohibits torture and inhumane treatment.
The Prime Minister has made stopping the boats a central part of his immigration policy. Rwanda, he and his ministers argue, will deter people from making the dangerous journey across the Channel. In recent years, many people have died from making that trip. The government says the travelling must stop to cut levels of illegal migration and to reduce the number of people dying.
46,000 people crossed the Channel last year. So far this year, more than 27,000 have done the same. That's 19,000 fewer people so far. Ever since the Rwanda policy was created, it's been bogged down in the courts and nobody has been sent to the country, with planes halted at the last minute. The Supreme Court judges will have looked at the following when making their judgment. Were the right tests applied when determining whether removal to Rwanda would breach Article 3? If the right tests were applied, was the Court of Appeal entitled to interfere with its conclusion that Rwanda was a safe third country? Were there substantial grounds for believing asylum seekers sent to Rwanda would face a real risk of bad treatment?
They'll also be looking at whether it's right that judges are able to interrogate a government agreement, basically. So you've got this government agreement between the governments of the United Kingdom and Rwanda saying that everybody will be properly looked after, everything's going to be fine. And really, is it appropriate and right that judges are able to review that and make an assessment for themselves as to whether that agreement will be respected by both governments?
Make sure you're not
Labour have called the plan unworkable, unethical and extortionately expensive. So far, the UK has paid the Rwandan government £140 million. Some campaigners have argued assurances from the African country's ministers were not sufficient to ensure that there is no real risk to asylum seekers. Sophie Lucas represents several clients who are at risk of deportation.
Well, many of our clients are survivors of torture, of trafficking. They've fled war-torn countries. They have been living in limbo, many of them since May last year. So the repercussions of tomorrow's decision will be felt very strongly by them and many others in the UK who came to seek refuge.
Which brings us to the allegations made by Suella Braverman in her letter this evening. She says the European Court of Human Rights Rule 39 would mean even if the government wins tomorrow, it could mean months of delay as claimants can use interim orders to appeal the decision. Some lawyers agree with the former Home Secretary that the government could have legislated more firmly to prevent this and make clear it would ignore Rule 39 in future. But others argue this year's Illegal Migration Act does give the government the power to ignore Rule 39, meaning migrants could be deported within weeks, though it could be a breach of international law to do this. It is by no means certain that the European Court would reconsider the case if the ruling is clear on human rights. Even before Suella Braverman's attack tonight on the Prime Minister, tomorrow was already set to be a big moment for one of its flagship policies. All eyes tomorrow on Courtroom 1 at the Supreme Court.
Seema there in a moment. We hope to speak to the Conservative MP for Cleethorpes, Martin Vickers. But first, let's talk to Labour's Dame Diana Johnson, who chairs the Home Affairs Select Committee. Thank you very much for joining us. The government, let's deal first with Rwanda. Whatever way it goes in the Supreme Court, the government says it's not stopping here. Let's say the Supreme Court goes against it. What can it legally do?
Well, I think we have to wait and see, obviously, what happens tomorrow. I think the whole thing about the Rwanda case, whether it's lawful or unlawful, we don't actually know whether this policy would work in practice. The Home Affairs Select Committee was really clear that the government are pursuing the Rwanda policy because they say it will deter people from getting in the small boats. We don't have evidence of that. So whether tomorrow they find, yes, you can go ahead and implement it, there's still a test about whether it actually practically works. If it doesn't, if they say it's unlawful, then the Prime Minister, the new Home Secretary are going to have to come up with Plan B, because their whole approach to small boats is based on the Rwandan policy.
Well, of course, they would say that the small boats are down by a third this year, and that could be about the potential issue of people being taken to Rwanda. That could be that.
It could be that.
Let's talk about the Rule 39. So what Suella Braverman seems to be getting at is that actually there's a way, if you leave the ECHR, then actually that doesn't matter. No matter what happens tomorrow, it doesn't actually matter. What's your reaction to that?
Well, the Home Affairs Select Committee has always looked at this in regard to international law, complying with our international obligations. We think that the government should have a range of policy responses to the small boats issue, not just the Rwanda policy, where there isn't the direct evidence that they need. So we say that within international law, there are a range of policy options the government could pursue to tackle the small boats issue.
Well, let's just, I mean, you're talking with your chair of the Home Affairs Select on just now, but let's talk to you as a Labour MP. What is Labour's deterrent?
Well, Yvette Cooper, as the Shadow Home Secretary, has set out very clearly what Labour would do. A range of things, from improving cross-border policing involvement, going after the people smugglers, taking action with our European colleagues to enter into arrangements.
Fair, the Conservative government's already made arrangements, cross-border arrangements with the police in Calais, and they have been doing the checks, they have been doing the returns.
Well, we think there's more that could be done, and actually they're not doing the returns.
They're not returns, sorry.
Yeah, they're not doing the returns, but we think there's more that they could do. But the Home Affairs Select Committee, which is cross-party, came up with a report last year with a whole series of policies that we thought the government should look at. Putting all their eggs into one basket on Rwanda, you know, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, is going to be a problem for them.
Let's turn now to tomorrow's debate on the King's speech. Now, there's an SNP amendment calling for a ceasefire. We know tonight now that there's going to be a Labour amendment, and the Labour amendment is going to say far too many deaths of innocent civilians in Gaza, including children. But the UK backs a rule-based international order and calls on Israel to protect hospitals. Now, you're Vice Chair of Labour Friends of Israel. Do you back the Labour amendment?
Yes, I'm very pleased that that amendment has been tabled tonight, and I will vote for it tomorrow. I think it sets out actually a framework for what we would like to see happen in terms of the development of the humanitarian pauses, moving on, hopefully, to a cessation of fighting. But clearly we do back international law. We back the fact that Israel, in taking the action that they can take to protect themselves, has to be within international humanitarian law.
Well, originally, we didn't know if there was going to be a Labour amendment, and a number of your colleagues, including, we understand, several shadow ministers, were going to back the SNP amendment. And the SNP amendment calls for a ceasefire. Keir Starmer has consistently refused to call for a ceasefire. If Labour colleagues think that the Labour amendment is not strong enough and they back the SNP amendment calling for a ceasefire, should Keir Starmer sack them?
Well, look, I'm a backbencher. I chair the Home Affairs Select Committee.
You're a senior politician.
I'm not on the Labour front bench. Clearly, I hope all my colleagues will now feel that that amendment, setting out what Labour's position is in full, recognising what Keir Starmer said in his Chatham House speech, building on, obviously, the dreadful events in the last few weeks. I hope that that amendment will mean that we can all rally around that Labour amendment and vote for that tomorrow.
Thank you very much indeed, Diana Johnson. Thank you. Well, we are having technical issues trying to speak to the Conservative MP Martin Vickers. We'll keep trying and hope to speak to him a little later in the show. The billionaire Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich, who for years enjoyed a high-profile life in the UK, including the ownership of Chelsea Football Club, has spent much of the past 2 decades denying links with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Those denials continued even after he was sanctioned by the UK and the EU Council last year, but not the US, for his proximity to the Russian leader and for allegedly profiting from the Kremlin regime. Abramovich has launched legal action to get the EU sanctions overturned, but now a major investigation by this programme with BBC Verify, Panorama and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism has found new evidence of an apparent financial link between the two men. Here's Ben.
The most famous Russian oligarch in the West.
Someone we've read a lot about over the past few years.
Oil tycoon and politician Roman Abramovich.
Britain's most famous
Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich.
A fixture in headlines for 2 decades thanks to his purchases of football clubs, yachts, art, property. But it all came crashing down for Roman Abramovich in February 2022.
It was unprovoked, but this is what Russian President Vladimir Putin unleashed on Ukraine.
Abramovich has links to Putin, who is mounting a barbaric and evil attack against the people of Ukraine.
Abramovich was sanctioned in March 2022 by the UK government and the EU Council. His assets frozen, banned from travelling. The justification? That he had supported and profited from Putin's regime. But Abramovich has said that it's unfair, that he had no significant financial connection to Putin. So was this a case of rough justice? Was the oligarch wronged? To find out, we've been on a journey from London to Cyprus, speaking to politicians.
It's almost like peeling back layers of an onion.
Financial experts.
I find it hard to believe that this is an innocent transaction.
Former Kremlin insiders.
When he came into government offices, like, everybody stood up.
And anti-corruption campaigners.
Cyprus cannot be used by oligarchs to support the dirty wars of Putin.
The journey started with some leaked documents from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists' Cyprus Confidential project. Allegations of a financial as well as a political connection between Roman Abramovich and Vladimir Putin have swirled for years, but Newsnight and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism have uncovered a paper trail of evidence which apparently shows it. It's new material which justifies those UK and EU sanctions and raises the question of whether the United States should follow. So what is this financial connection between Roman Abramovich and Vladimir Putin that Newsnight, BBC Verify and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism have uncovered? Roman Abramovich was the beneficiary of a trust which ultimately owned 2 Cypriot-registered shell companies called Finoto and Grosora through a series of other shell companies. In 2003, these two companies each acquired a 12.5% stake in Russia's monopoly TV advertising company Video International for a mysteriously low price of just $130,000 each. By 2010, the entities had made $30 million in dividends from Video International. But in late 2010, Finoto sold its lucrative stake in Video International to another Cypriot shell company called Med Media Network, and Grosora sold its stake in the advertising company to yet another Cypriot shell company called Namiral Trading. Despite Video International reporting revenues of $3 billion in that year, these stakes were sold for just $20 million each, a price that appears to be below a reasonable assessment of their fair value. The nominal beneficial owner of Med Media Network was a man called Sergei Roldugin, and the nominal beneficial owner of Namiral was Alexander Plekov. Roldugin is a Russian cellist and conductor, but he's known Putin since childhood and is godfather to his daughter. And he's been described as Putin's wallet by the Swiss government. Plekov has been identified by the UK government as another close friend of Putin. So what this paper trail suggests is that Abramovich effectively transferred a 25% stake in a Russian company with multi-billion-dollar revenues to individuals close to Putin for a price that appears to be below fair market value.
Abramovich was well connected in top power circles. When he came into government offices, like, everybody stood up.
Vladimir Milov is a former deputy energy minister of Russia under Putin in the early 2000s, now turned opponent in exile.
I can see that, brick by brick, international investigative community is building a pretty solid tower of evidence connecting Abramovich to Putin. And I think this desire to hide it was intentional because Putin needed such people at the international stage who nominally have no connection with him on surface, but are also very loyal and might be used in projecting his interests abroad. So in this regard, they both undertook very significant measures to hide their connection, and it's very good that the investigative community keeps exposing it.
We showed our findings to Tom Keating, a veteran finance and security analyst. They might argue that this is simply an innocent transaction between two parties. How credible is that, do you think?
I find it hard to believe that this is an innocent transaction between two parties. Firstly, because the individuals involved have a track record of facilitating this kind of transaction. And secondly, this is a sort of mechanism that we've seen on a number of occasions before to transfer value between individuals connected with the Kremlin and the Kremlin. So on the face of it, this would seem to be far from innocent.
Their friendship is something that's been long understood, but that confirmation is really important because it's almost like peeling back layers of an onion. People don't want to get to the heart of the truth of this, but the reporting that you found gives us the clearest indicator we have yet that everything the government has done is absolutely legally sound, that there is a link.
How do you establish a link? You follow the money. And the road led us to a sunny Mediterranean island with a reputation for hiding fortunes in dark corners. So how did we get this vital information, this confirmation of an apparent financial connection between Roman Abramovich and Vladimir Putin? It's because of a leak of documents from a firm here in Cyprus called Merit Service, which had been looking after Roman Abramovich's global financial fortune. Why Cyprus? Well, because for the past 2 decades, Cyprus, or Moscow on the Med as it's sometimes known, had played a key role in taking Russian money, distributing it around the globe in a way that couldn't be linked back to its ultimate owners. So, troublingly, an EU member state's legal and accounting services had helped to conceal a link between the most famous Russian oligarch in the West and the Russian president.
I think what we can see here for the first time is a much larger picture of the scale of the operation, the scale of the entanglement of Cyprus with Russia, the importance of Cyprus as a member of Europe and part of the Eurozone, and how vital it is to Russian interests. What we are actually seeing is an operation within Europe, a sophisticated, clandestine operation, at odds, completely at odds with Western interests.
But the sanctions imposed on Russian oligarchs by Europe and the US, and by the UK government directly on merit service, means the island has now finally been forced to change its ways, says one anti-corruption campaigner and MP.
The sanctions brought home that Cyprus cannot be used by oligarchs to support the dirty wars of Putin. I believe that Cyprus got the message. I believe that professionals in Cyprus, banks and the financial sector got the message that this is the end. Whatever happened, happened. We have to clean our act. We have to put an end to people coming to Cyprus because we had a very relaxed system. Now the system, on the contrary, is very, very strict. And I believe that Cyprus is going to gain again its place in the financial industry of the European Union.
Though some analysts say the jury is still out on Cyprus's compliance. And there is also other unfinished business. Abramovich has still not been sanctioned by the US government, reportedly because the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky requested it in light of Abramovich's role in peace talks in the wake of the invasion.
Negotiating behind the scenes, the Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich. Today, the Kremlin...
There was some hope associated with him in the early months of Putin's aggression against Ukraine, that he might be useful as some form of intermediary in some kind of negotiations and so on. But I think nearly 2 years down the road, as the war rages on, we can see that it's largely a false hope. It's pretty useless, and he should be sanctioned. He's one of the major enablers of the Putin system who still evades US sanctions, and I think that should be corrected.
And are there lessons from this story for the UK and the network of industries that has arisen to profit from foreign money of questionable provenance?
We still haven't done enough to rid ourselves of these ill-gotten rubles and other currencies from around the world. We've taken action against the banks, but it's the enablers. You know, we need to deal with the estate agents, the accountants, the lawyers, all these people who've created for themselves an industry around these high net worth individuals who stole their money from the Russian people, who stole their money from people around the world, who imagine what could have been achieved had that money been invested in the futures of those countries instead.
Despite attempts to contact Mr. Abramovich, Mr. Roldugin and Mr. Plekov for a comment, we did not get a response. The true relationship between the oligarch and the president comes into focus and raises uncomfortable questions about how it was facilitated and concealed for so long and who it profited.
Ben there. The White House said tonight that it has its own intelligence that Hamas was using Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City to run its military operations and probably to store weapons, saying those actions constituted a war crime. In the last hour, Hamas, recognised of course as a terrorist group by many Western nations, responded to say America's statement gave a green light to Israel to commit further brutal massacres targeting hospitals with the goal of destroying Gaza's healthcare system. Well, tonight, Israeli forces surround the hospital where a mass grave has been dug to bury patients who've not been able to have family burials because of the intense fighting. Hundreds of patients have little food or water. There are babies dependent on incubators, which hospital staff say are now no longer working. There are medical staff there, ordinary Gazans. They're all trapped in the hospital. Here's Mark with what we know.
The fate of Gaza's hospitals has now become a major matter of international concern, with President Biden insisting they must be protected and the belligerents waging information warfare about those inside. Israeli advances in Gaza have brought bombardments to the gates of the Indonesian and Al-Quds hospitals, but it's the biggest complex, the Al-Shifa, which is now key to what happens next. Hamas says there are 650 patients and around 6,000 others sheltering there. The Israelis argue that the number sheltering is smaller, maybe 2,000, and have said since the outset that Hamas uses tunnels underneath the hospital as a headquarters. The Israelis have released footage of Palestinians with a rocket-propelled grenade using the Al-Quds hospital as cover. And yesterday, they showed soldiers delivering 300 litres of fuel to the Al-Shifa for use in its generators. Independent analysts have verified both bits of footage. But the Palestinians say it was too dangerous to get the fuel deposited outside by the Israelis, and that the amount was completely inadequate to serve their generators for any significant amount of time. The complex itself is now tightly encircled.
Moving from one building to another inside the hospital is a risk, and he said even like burying the people is a risk, because tanks are surrounding the hospital from all around the the hospital is quite big. I've been to this hospital hundreds of times. It's about like 6-7 huge building in one complex, and it's facing 4 directions. Tanks were in 3 directions up until yesterday, but overnight he said tanks are also close to the main gate of the hospital.
Inside, they've released pictures of premature babies removed from incubators because of the power shortage, saying some have died. Israel has countered with images of incubators it says it can deliver. The problem evidently is with fuel, not the actual equipment. Fuel shortages are also being blamed by humanitarian organisations for having to shut down a water desalination plant. The Israelis have mocked those agencies for saying that they were about to run out of fuel for weeks now. You may remember a couple of weeks ago a big UN agency saying it would start to shut down the next day. So how have they kept going? Evidently, there were some stores of fuel under the control of Hamas and the UN. But we've also heard that in the last couple of weeks, some fuel shipments have been distributed in Gaza under the auspices of a United Nations agency, UN Operations, or UNOPS. Neither side was keen to publicise this, the Israelis having said early on that not a drop would get in until hostages were released, and the Palestinians not wanting to flag up that some generators were being kept running with Israeli cooperation. But in the last couple of days, fuel shortages have caused the closure of the Al-Quds hospital and greatly hampered other facilities too. So why is fuel now not reaching the Al-Shifa hospital? With Israeli troops closely surrounding it and intermittent exchanges of gunfire, it may just be too dangerous. That question of safety also applies to why ambulances haven't been used to evacuate Palestinian patients down the 2 routes that are now subject to periodic ceasefires. Efforts are underway to build additional field hospitals in the south, as well as hospital ships from Italy, Turkey and France being en route. There are logistic and security questions to be resolved, but both sides right now see the Al-Shifa hospital as a powerful symbol of control. It may also be that the issue has become linked again with the release of hostages, that fuel is deliberately being held up by Israel as part of a negotiation. Once again, there's speculation about a possible phased release of those kidnapped people being linked to a humanitarian ceasefire, rumours fed by President Biden today. Any decision by Israel to enter the Al-Shifa hospital in the coming hours could be linked to the progress or otherwise of the hostage negotiation.
Mark, well, let's talk a bit about that now. Joining us now is Mark Regev, Senior Advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister. Mark Regev, thank you for joining us. Just repeating what the White House said there, they have their intelligence that Hamas is using Al-Shifa as a military headquarters, what Israel has been saying for some time now. However, there are hundreds of sick in there, there are babies in there, there are ordinary Gazans, there are doctors and there are nurses. Can you tell us that the Israeli Defense Forces will not try and go into the hospital?
Kirsty, I can tell you that we've offered fuel for the hospital, for the incubators for the babies. That was refused by Hamas under Hamas pressure. And we've also offered to help evacuate the hospital, as was done with the other hospital, the Rantisi hospital. That was also refused. Quite frankly, even the babies, we could have had ambulances or something like that, take them out. And it could have been done. But Hamas is interested in the humanitarian catastrophe. It's their way of putting pressure for a ceasefire. It's clear what they want. We're hitting them hard. They want a ceasefire, and therefore they are deliberately...
But I want to ask you, Mark Regev, Joe Biden said today, no matter Hamas actions, hospitals and patients must be protected. We want no firefights in hospitals. So I ask you again, will the IDF not go into Al-Shifa? Will there be no firefights in hospitals?
I just want to finish my previous point. Just 1 second, please. They have torpedoed, Hamas has torpedoed deliberately all attempts to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in the hospital. But to answer your question, we do not target hospitals. We target Hamas. But it's clear to everyone that Hamas has built an elaborate military structure underneath the hospital, a subterranean network of bunkers, command posts, rocket launching sites that goes for kilometer after kilometer after kilometer. And this has been confirmed by the Americans. And I would dare say that I know, that the population of Gaza cities knows this very, very well too.
Right. Well, let me just say, if you were to go in, if the IDF were to go into Al-Shifa hospital, they could not protect patients, nurses and doctors. No matter what Hamas does with nurses, patients and doctors, if the IDF went in, you could not protect patients, nurses and doctors. And what Joe Biden is saying is that the hospitals are not to be used in such a way.
Well, once again, I didn't say we were going to go into the hospital.
No, I'm just asking you if you're not going to go in. Because what I also wanted to ask you is, there are more than 200 hostages, many of whom are Israeli. How can you be sure that some of those hostages are not at Al-Shifa hospital?
We can't be 100% sure where the hostages are, unfortunately. We have intelligence, but we can't be 100% sure where they all are. There was information that when the hostages were taken, they were taken first to the hospital, and from there they were distributed to other places. But this is just another sign that Hamas has used the hospital as its command and control underneath the hospital. And anyone who has concerns about the hospital, as I do, as the Israeli government does, I mean, ultimately, who has turned the hospital into a war zone? It is Hamas. Now, we have no intention of attacking the hospital. Our enemy is not the patients in the hospital. Our enemy is Hamas. And we will be as surgical as is possible in a complex combat situation. We distinguish between Hamas, who is our enemy, and the innocent civilians in the hospital. Of course, we don't target them.
So what you've just said is you've absolutely no intention of attacking the hospital. But the terrible truth is, if there is a firefight in that hospital, you will lose doctors, nurses, patients, babies. You may also lose hostages. And in a way, the problem with that is that these hostages who've had such a terrible, terrible ordeal for the last 5 weeks for their families, the very idea that they could be in that hospital and in even greater danger is so terrifying for them.
Of course, we have to take all these things into consideration. But we have to be clear. Our goal in this operation is to destroy Hamas's military machine, and that cannot be done without destroying Hamas's network of underground tunnels that are under this hospital. So once again, we have to be as surgical as we can in a difficult combat situation.
So what you seem to be saying is you are going to be surgical, so there will be some form of attack. At the same time, I want to ask you about the hostages, because in parallel with everything that's going on in the ground, we understand that there are negotiations for the release of the hostages. Now, as we know, there have not been any hostage releases for some time now. Can you give us any sense of where these negotiations are?
Well, obviously, I can't go into too much detail, but I can say the following. If there is now more optimism that a hostage release could be forthcoming, and once again, we're not there yet, but if there is more optimism, it's precisely because Hamas has been put under massive pressure. I mean, they kidnapped, as you reported, about 240 people, of which 32 are children. They kidnapped babies, they kidnapped infants, disgusting behavior. They showed us who they are. What sort of people kidnap babies and infants?
Thank you. I'm afraid, Mark Reagan,
we believe the pressure on Hamas, the military pressure that we're applying now, will expedite the release of hostages because Hamas has to understand that this is the only way.
Thank you, Mark Reagan. I'm afraid I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we've run right out of time. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. So before we go, we started tonight with a sense of problems tomorrow for the Prime Minister. Nick's back now with details on what could be an equally challenging day for Keir Starmer as he faces down critics within his own party who want him to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. Sorry, we had to cut Mark Regev in there because you've got news.
Well, Kirsty, as you were saying, in the last 30 minutes or so, we have seen the Labour amendment to the King's speech tomorrow on Gaza, and we are seeing some movement by Keir Starmer. Now, until now, he's been saying no to an immediate ceasefire, yes to humanitarian pauses, This is what he's saying tomorrow. Hopefully we'll be able to see this on the screen, talking about the importance of daily humanitarian pauses. But then crucially, he says they must be longer to deliver humanitarian assistance on a scale that begins to meet the desperate needs of the Gaza people. And then listen to that. That is a necessary step to an enduring cessation of fighting. So, talking to people close to Keir Starmer, they're saying no change on the principle, wrong to have an immediate ceasefire because that would freeze the conflict in Hamas's favour. But what they are saying is he is recognising the changes that have taken place in the 2 weeks or so since he delivered his big speech on this at Chatham House. Now, his language is designed to win over all those Labour frontbenchers who want a ceasefire right now. The Labour leadership, very nervous, lots of conversations today. And the reason why they're nervous is expecting an SNP amendment tomorrow, which is calling for an immediate ceasefire. Labour will be hoping its amendment will knock out the SNP one, but the SNP are absolutely confident that their amendment will be called because day 3 of voting on a King's speech is for the third party, and they, the SNP, are the third party.
Nick, thank you very much indeed. Well, we have managed to sort out our technical gremlins with the Conservative MP Martin Vickers, so let's return to our top story. Suella Braverman's blistering attack on Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the judgment on the legality of the government's Rwanda scheme due tomorrow morning. Martin Vickers, thank you. We finally managed to get through to you. Can I just begin with Suella Braverman's letter? She said of Rishi Sunak he was lacking in qualities of leadership. He'd reneged on a deal. He never had any intention of following his promises, incompetent or a liar. What is your response? We shouldn't actually use the word liar, but I'm just saying one or the other. You know, something's gone very badly wrong. What's your response to the tenor of that letter and to what Suella Braverman said?
I think it's very unfortunate. The reality is quite clearly there was a breakdown of the working relationship between the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, which is extremely unfortunate. But what I find unforgivable from Suella is that the tone of her letter is actually damaging to every Conservative candidate in next year's election, because unless we go into the election united behind Rishi Sunak, I'm afraid the chances of success are more remote than ever.
Well, just on that point, what do you think the likelihood is that she will garner a lot of support around her or not, as exactly as you were saying, given the tenor of the letter?
Well, she does have some support, and if we go back to the original issue about her article in the Times last week, I found that unfortunate. And even though I may share some of her concerns about some approaches from the police in the past, the fact is the Home Secretary should not in any way undermine the authority of the police in public the way she did.
Right. Well,
now, as to whether other members share her views, yes, there are a handful of Tory members, but an insignificant number as in the whole.
So just yes or no, absolutely right to sack her?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
So let's talk about the Supreme Court decision tomorrow, because Suella Braverman was on the attack on Rishi Sunak, saying because he wouldn't essentially support leaving the ECHR, he's put the country and the Labour Tories' position on immigration in a much weaker position. And she implies that if he doesn't agree to leave the ECHR, and we know, of course, that the new Home Secretary isn't minded either, then he risks a rebellion. Would you join a rebellion over his adherence to the ECHR if it means less chance of deportation of migrants?
Well, I think what we've got to bear in mind is that the Prime Minister has already made very clear that nothing is off the table. And by that, I take it to mean that he is prepared as a last resort to remove the UK from the ECHR. I personally would support that in those circumstances. But if there are other options available, let's hear from them. I'm sure that the government does have a plan B, unlike what Suella said in her letter. I'm sure there is a plan B. Let's get the judgment tomorrow. Let's hear the Prime Minister's response. And if, as he's previously said, nothing is off the table, and if we have to take that route, I will be right behind him.
Thank you very much for joining us, Martin Vickers. Well, that's all from us tonight. Victoria's here tomorrow. Until then, sleep well. Goodbye.
Hello there. Some heavy showers around at times today, particularly